Awesome. I didn't realize this was the first lecture, so that's good for you all because we're going to start the bar very low today, trust me. So yeah, I'm just going to keep the intro short because there's no reason to go on about anything. I think what's applicable here is I've been in the outdoor industry in various capacities for quite a few years now. And right now the work I do focuses in climbing. I'm a board member for the American Alpine Club and was recently a staff member, director of the Climb United program. So it was this way that we were going to lean into cultural transformation, emerging populations in climbing, and build a more inclusive, bigger, fuller space for all climbers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here. And then in other ways, I've been in the outdoor industry, tangential to it in the past couple of decades, in the corporate environment and similar things. But I'm just really a passionate climber and trail runner and all sorts of outdoor stuff. So, but again, we'll get more into that in here, so I don't want to go on about that too much. But where I do want to start is what I was asked to talk about is equity and inclusion in the outdoors. And it's interesting because I had lunch with Seth and Natalie, and what they shared was a lot of you already bring that conversation into this space. And I'm having the opposite experience where I'm brought into spaces and paid now as a consultant to talk to organizations about equity and inclusion. But the conversations are really forced. It's often that they're like, we know this is a thing, and we should have something to do with this. We don't really know why, but your job is to come, put it into place, and we'll do what you say, kind of deal. Give us some trainings, teach us some words, what those words mean, and we'll figure out how to make it look pretty in marketing. So I was really glad to hear that y'all are having those conversations organically and the stuff you care about and you want to bring into the outdoor spaces because it's really important. But I also think it's important that we rethink everything that is already being done and the way that you all are going to do this as the future leaders in the outdoor industry, which is exciting. I'm excited, I'm going to be working with all of you and working for you at some point, I'm sure, as you come into the industry, which is awesome because now I get to know all the secrets that you all are talking about, which is good. It helps me do better. So I want to start by talking about some words from Jelani Cobb. So he is an author, has published in The Economist and The New Yorker, New York Times, and he's the dean of the School of Journalism for Columbia University. And I was at this outdoor industry event, and he was our keynote opening lecturer. And he's this very, very big man. He's like 6'3". Kind of reminds me, does Uncle Phil from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, does that? Okay, good. I was like, oh crap, I don't know if everyone's gonna get this. He's a master orator, and of course, since he's the dean of journalism, he has an incredible handle of words. And everybody, this room of, there are maybe 6 dozen of us, outdoor industry leaders, are just hanging on every word. And I noticed that all of us wrote down the same thing when he said this. And if I can get this to work. I promise this slide won't be just a lot of words. This will be one of the very few times. But he said, the only way in which we have ever made social progress is by beginning to recognize our own fallibility, our own complicity, and then proactively saying, it is incumbent upon us to do something different. The willingness to step aside from our comfortable position and ask ourselves how we factor, how we benefit, and how we replicate the kinds of pre-existing conditions that we see routing disaster through the societal rain gutter, which that is mastery of words, to the most vulnerable parts of our population, which it's an incredible statement. And again, everyone's scribbling this down in their notebooks. But what I think is the most important part is that it is incumbent upon us to do something different. And where we get lost in doing this is this amalgamation of words, this word salad, right? We're thinking about the meaning of words and we get lost in meaning making. And that whole event after this incredible keynote speech, it was 2.5 days in DC with legislators came in and Ryan Gellert, the CEO of Patagonia, came in and we're just talking about things. But no one's actually putting down what we're going to do. They're just getting lost in understanding words and meanings and all these different things. And so there were a handful of us who were just chomping at the bit to do something. And we left there honestly having done nothing. Nothing at all. We had all this stuff written down, all these actions. They had this beautiful, this person was drawing this word picture thing. I don't know what to call it. Every time we came up with new words, they would draw a representative picture on a whiteboard. and then the OIA produced their strategic plan based on what we had talked about. And most of what we talked about was not on the strategic plan. It was all the easy stuff, stand up a DEI committee and build a more inclusive outdoors, but there was no action to it. And so what I hope is we can talk about action in this room, because you all are innovators, right? Like folks of my generation, there's like data behind this. In your 20s, you're innovating, and beyond that, you really aren't an innovative thinker. You're a crystallized thinker. You can take innovative ideas and put them into action through experiences. But that's why you see tech industry, most folks who start tech companies are in their 20s, and by the time they're in their 30s, they try to innovate again and they fail. We just don't have new ideas at some point. But I want to back up a little bit and just talk about the way I was raised and why I'm kind of like have more of a pugilist mindset when it comes to this. So like we need to fight for change and we need to make action happen. So I was actually born in South Korea, but I was adopted into a white family in Tillamook, Oregon. And this is truly all there is of Tillamook. It's like 4,000 people. And I kid you not, if you follow this Highway 6 out to this neighborhood, that is where I grew up, right here, and like this is town. It was a nothing town. And has anybody heard of Tillamook at all? Yeah, exactly. The cheese. So this is our cheese factory. Like this is the place. It was my first job when I was 14, and my father worked at the cheese factory for 29 and a half years. I remember actually applied for a job to be a busboy at 14, because you could work at 14, and I was terrified because I don't know if you have to do them anymore. We had to do drug tests. And I was smoking quite a bit of pot, and I was like, oh, God, this is how my parents find out. Thankfully, I passed the drug test somehow. But so, yeah, this is like my whole experience growing up was the Tillamook Cheese Factory in Tillamook and being outdoors. But the reason I bring this up is because everything I did was outdoors. As you saw in that prior slide, we lived on the edge of the Tillamook National Forest. And so I was outside, I was camping, I was fishing with my father and hunting and shooting guns and off-road vehicles and all these things. So I had this love of the outdoors and this deep connection to it through my family. And so when I started into my career, like I said, I was tangential to the outdoor industry. So I worked in the lumber mill industry for a little bit, worked in hunting and shooting, and always around folks who also were outdoor users. So it made work enjoyable. And I had some stints in software and medical devices and other things, but it never really felt as natural to me as to be around other outdoor users. So, in life we have these winding paths, and we keep on finding our way back to like that passion that we have in our lives. And like Jelani Cobb said, we do succumb to our own fallibility. And so you kind of lose sense of where you want to go in your life, and you find your way back somehow. And so we all kind of go through these things. We're trying to balance out your education and what you want to do with work, and you might have that kind of a conflict of, I love the outdoors, and I want more people to enjoy the outdoors. But I also know that this is a pretty privileged space to be in, right? This town, this university, this program, and the outdoors in general. We like to say the outdoors is for all, because it is, and it doesn't discriminate. But the ability to go outside, it kind of does discriminate, right? It's not easy. It's not necessarily cheap to afford the right clothing, the right gear, to get into the towns, to go outside and things like this. So we're grappling with these things. And the outdoor industry is aware of this, but only like a little bit aware, because it's still making a decent amount of money. It's a sustainable economy. But I'm going to kind of flash back again a little bit. Then 2020 happens, right? And sorry, that slide was supposed to accompany the last bit I was talking about. I'm just working in like pictures I've taken over the years of like climbing in beautiful spaces, so you have other things to look at besides my stupid face. So, well, there was another one. Sorry, I should have been flashing these the whole time. I should have practiced this. That, I think, is the last one. Perfect. Here it comes. 2020 happens. There we go. Okay. And so that's why we're having conversations like this now. So we have the COVID-19 pandemic, George Floyd, and then, of course, Donald Trump. And what it does is it puts us in this mindset that, not all things are created equal. And this country is quite divided. even as much as we might have wanted to not talk about it in the outdoors. Because we start bringing that up, and I'm sure all of you have heard, or maybe you've said it, and I know I've said it. I hate to say I'm guilty of it, but like, hey, like, I go to the outdoors to escape the world. Like, let's leave all that out of it. But after, again, 2020, we start standing up the pledge, and the In Solidarity Project, and the Oath, right? So these are pretty decent programs, started with really, really good intent. But most of them are, if I might be so bold, pretty performative. And they were a way for organizations to pay people to get a pretty average training to say that they've signed up for it and they've done their part. They understand now. They get the whole anti-racism thing. They get equity. They get DEI. And maybe it was a good start. But it did lead to some positive things. Some of the experience I have, again, I mentioned Climbing United with the American Alpine Club. So I was hired by the club. Uh-oh. Oh, boy. Sorry. I think I can go here and start from there. Can we? Yes. So I was hired to get Climbing United stood up, basically. When I got there, it was an idea. And we had funding from REI and Eddie Bauer. And the reason I mention that is one of the two of those had a pretty big horse in the race. REI had made some pretty big missteps. Is anybody familiar with Mountain Project? So it's this whole collection. I'm glad that there's some head nods because you can and jump in at any time. Like anybody interrupt me at all. Like just interrupt me, correct me, anything like that. So Mountain Project is like this log of all the climate information for the United States. And you can get your information, your beta on where the climb is, how to access it, what time of year it's good for, and the names. So I'll briefly mention climbing route names. So if there's a cliff like this, and you are the first ascensionist, so you go to this cliff and there's no bolts in it, and you either do it from the grounds up, so you start at the bottom and you drill the bolts in from the ground, or you can go to the top and set a rope and rappel in it and drill it that way. And you climb it first. You're the first ascensionist, and you get to name it. And in the history of route naming, there have been some pretty bad route names. And if like you're thinking, oh, how bad could a route name be? Like if you imagine somebody being like anti-Semitic, using the N-word, sexual aggression, like things like that in route names, they're in there. And so REI owned Mountain Project, and they had those route names out there. And the public had been asking for a while, like, can you do something about this? It's technology. You could push a button and all those route names go away. But the conversation, and there's also forums on Mountain Project, which got horrible, like hate speech in these forums. So REI did what they do best, and they just sold it. They got rid of the problem. But everyone knew, like, you didn't do anything about it, you sold it. And so they supported Climbing United. But one of the things that we were supposed to do was address route naming, kind of do their dirty work. And we were going to do that later on. We were going to build a program up, get people excited about it, make it like this really positive thing. But after I got in there and started to build a program, and I realized this is not how we want to do this. We want to come out of the gate like fighting. We want to make sure folks know we're not going to just do like the really easy thing and stand up at the EI committee and talk about this. We're going to address this problem. And the way we did that was we got, I'd say about 20 folks from the industry, guidebook authors, first ascensionists, climbing affinity group leaders, some athletes and some others in some Zoom calls. And we started to talk about this issue, which I thought would be pretty clean cut. There's right and there's wrong. I was very, very wrong in that assumption. It was tough. We started with 20 people, and it ended up being maybe 10 left by the second conversation. There was a lot of claims of censorship that we had no right to, and we weren't going to change any names as the American Alpine Club. We were simply going to put forth a set of standards and guidelines that we hope people would follow. So I ended up producing a list of words and phrases that should not be repeated. and it's published online, and it's horrible. You don't want to look at it. It's like everything you don't want to see. But we had to put it out there so the public could say, like, this is derogatory. These are words that we don't think should be used in route names. And we had a set of guidelines that first ascensionists and publishers and authors that they could go by. And we released this through social media. Took us a couple of months to put it all together. And if you're familiar, this is the topo. So this kind of tells you the grade and like different information about ledges and what way a corner might face and things like that for this route called Astroman in Yosemite, which there's nothing wrong with the name Astroman. But we knew that people would lose their minds if we put that we're going to change the name of this. Like, we wanted to catch people's attention. So it was like, make this thing bold. We put it out there. My buddy Jeff Dykes, who was our brand director at the club, created this really like striking image, right? Like black, red, wow. And it set the climbing world on fire. We get like 20 comments on our Instagram posts, like American Alpine Club, like people aren't like super engaged. We had nearly 1,000 comments, emails flooding in, phone, we have a phone still, like people call our hotline. Tons of calls to the point where we actually had to take our customer service rep off the phone because she was hearing things that nobody should have to hear. I mean, it got wild. We got threats of people were going to sue us, that we were censors. I had direct calls to be fired, to resign. The Alpine Club was going to they were asking us to draft a letter of apology, all this stuff. It was wild, but it was exactly what we wanted. Because we needed people to know that we were taking a stance. Like, this is not okay. Using certain words and things are not okay. But this was nothing that wild that we did. We just said, like, I think I clicked through it. The one was just a guideline. It was, if the route name exists and it's derogatory, reach out to the first ascensionist and just talk to them about it. Like, hey, here's why this is a derogatory route name. Here's why it's a problem. Would you like to change it? Would you like to think about it? And then reach out to the publisher. Like, we've gotten permission to change this. When you release the new guidebook, change the name in there. And on Mountain Project, yeah.
I'm just wondering, in your opinion, with these people that named these routes, do you think they did so because of, like, they just thought the controversial name was just, like, just exciting because it's controversial, or, I mean, or do you really believe that they're, anti-Semitic or racist?
That's a good question. During this time, I had conversations with a lot of people, and a lot of people who opposed this work. And I would say there were a handful, maybe 2 handfuls, that were racist, were sexist, and were anti-Semitic. And there were some who just wanted to push the envelope. They just thought this was their right. And I actually had a conversation in Salt Lake City, where I live, in public, in this restaurant called the Porcupine. It's like a lot of families in there. Yeah, you've been there. Like, after you climb in the canyons, you go down there. And he is, as loud as you can, using the N-word to prove a point that that is his right to use it. And anybody who says not is a censor, and started the standard line of junk where it's comparing it to Nazism and all this crap. So there are people in society, right, and in climbing, that they just want to like ring the bell of getting people fired up. Which is a great question, because that's why it was like, this was nothing that wild. I mean, this was as soft as we can go. Like, just talk to people. If they want to change the name, change the name. If they don't, just put a line through it, and a mountain project, just put redacted over it and call it good, which is happening. And the great thing is it's happening, and I would say 99% of the people we reached out to fully supported changing the names. A couple didn't, and the publishers and Onyx, who now owns Mountain Project, said, great, find somewhere else to publish your climate information. We're not going to do it. And of course, a week later, they said, oh, everybody's in on this, so I guess I'll change the route names. And the really cool thing is it's having a bigger impact locally. Local climate organizations are all around the country in like very famous climbing areas. They work with the public a lot. And what we've been hearing from them is that first ascensionists are reaching out to them saying, hey, I've got all these route names, and I think some of them might be borderline offensive. There's a story behind it, but I'm realizing, I'm learning the story doesn't matter. If it offends people, it offends people. So I want to change them. And I mean, there are really cool stories out there. Like landowners are inviting like diverse populations out to their land to show them like, here's how you bolt, and like you do a whole crag, right? And so it sparked some really good work. And you know, I think though, like that the whole example of this, and it's funny, like I'm proud of this work, but at the same time, I think it like is exactly what. Sorry, I was gonna go through that faster. I forgot that I had that on there. I'm really proud of it because it did some positive things. And this is an event that we held in Bishop during the Kragan Classic. So the American Alpine Club has all these big climbing festivals around the country every year during the fall. We just wrapped them up, actually. I just got back from the Bishop one. This is not a photo of this year's, it's last year's. But we did a clinic out there for Climbing Night and brought folks, it was free of charge, folks from diverse communities and backgrounds together just to climb. And you know, these people now like are lifelong friends. Like Noam, for example, here, his first time ever climbing outdoors, and he came back this year. And Farley, his buddy here, got into climbing because he's a food writer for the LA Eater, which is a world I was not familiar with. But he had put on a lot of weight, as he puts it, because his job is to eat at like every restaurant in LA. So he was like, oh, this climbing thing seems pretty cool. And they came out to do this. And like we all had these great friendships. And like I could go on about all these people. So what we did is positive. So again, it's hard to say this, but I think it's also like not that big. We did like the bare minimum. We like addressed some route names and we got some people together and we went climbing. Like it's not that hard. It's pretty basic. So I kind of wanted to like have you all thinking about like, yeah, that's not that much. Like you were paid to do that. That seems kind of ridiculous because it kind of is. And then I'll tell you about some other work that's happening. And then I just like want to start dissecting it and see like what honestly something better sounds like. Sorry, there's just more photos. Oh, this was cool. This was after Noam had just done this really scary, like what we call a high ball. So it's like, you don't want to fall. We'll just put it that way. You climb high enough that if you fall, like you're not going to die, but you're not going to like walk away on your own. And it was awesome just to see the two of them up there, like after Noam had done that. So I wanted to share that photo. We're going to keep going through. Oh, and this was great. So Shara Zaya, who attended the event, is now the Climbing United manager, which is friggin' awesome. So we're like building great things again, but I just don't think it's enough. Because I also think about, you know, part of my job was to heal some relationships, we like to say, from the Alpine Club to affinity groups. Is anybody familiar with Brown Girls Climbs? So yeah, so they were started by Bethany Leibowitz, who lives here in Boulder, and it was specifically for brown and black women to go climbing and to learn about climbing and to build community across the country. And they hate the American Alpine Club, like hate with a capital H, for good reason. The club has been problematic in its past, and we could talk about that if you want, and I'm happy to talk about things we're doing to improve that. So we went on a hike, Bethany and I did. It was around here somewhere. I can't remember the trail. She was pregnant at the time, and it was just a really good time. We spent a couple hours together, but at the end of it, she's like, there's no way that Brown Girls Climbs and the American Alpine Club are going to have a relationship even in the next 2 or 3 years. And when I asked her why, it's because of everything I just talked about. She said, what you're doing is like the bare minimum. It seems to be you're doing the bidding for the corporation that funded your program, and that's it. And she was 100% right. That was my job. I was handed 7 pages of the Climbing United programming, and it was all 7 pages that were signed off on by REI and Eddie Bauer. And that is kind of part of this sad fact about, well, just business and capitalism in general. But right now, DEI in the outdoor industry. It is a prescription set forth by those who hold power and privilege, which are predominantly older, cis, hetero, white men right now. And they don't understand the work. They're not doing the time to learn. And so they say, okay, we can do these things that seem flashy and big, and they're going to grab attention, and we'll be good. And so another way we're trying to address DEI in the outdoor industry is through some work that I'm doing with Crux Academy. So it's akin to Masterclass. It's an online learning management system, and it's actually based also here out of Boulder. Louder Than 11 Studios does all the production work, and I got brought in to write the curriculum for some equity and inclusion learning modules. So we cover bias and sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexuality, and then race. And we go into the history of all these things and the science and the faulty science of all these things. And we're working in partnership with REI. So this has been a really exciting project, as we've been able to really dig in to these topics with industry leaders. And Addie Gao actually was a lecturer last year for this program, and she was priorly with Ascent Inclusion Consulting, and is now at Altera. She's been doing equity and inclusion work for decades, before most people knew it was a thing. And we had Wynn talking about gender and gender identity and expression and sexuality, and this has been really positive. And I dug into the history of race and decoding all these things that we believe to be true about science and how race is science, which it is absolutely not. There's no scientific standing of race. And I'm going to do a little clip here. Hopefully the volume works to just kind of show what we were. Okay, let me see here. Well, it's all good. It was just an example of the conversations, but for that one we were talking about bias and implicit bias, and just giving base examples of what these things are. But again, I'm going to be really critical of work that I'm proud of, but it's nothing that's going to change the world. I guarantee if y'all went through those modules, we have about an hour and a half worth of content. You're not going to find too much that you don't already know. The only stuff might be some of the historical references, but it's also stuff that you don't necessarily need to learn as a baseline because it's already exists in your lives. We're trying to educate a group of folks who, as one company executive put it to me, the blacks. He said, I get it, the CEI stuff, we care about the blacks. We care about them now. And those were his words. And it was quite striking, but it wasn't that, wasn't that surprising, really. So I'm going to talk for only a little bit longer, and then I want to hear all your thoughts. So again, if I'm asked to think about where DEI is in the outdoor industry right now, I don't think it's super, super far. And I think about these words. 1978, James Black was a scientist for ExxonMobil, and he had sent this whole letter to the executive committee for Exxon talking about climate change. And his finding was doubling CO2 gases in the atmosphere would increase the global average temperature by 2 to 3 degrees, which is interesting. In 1978, he was talking about the same numbers that the Biden administration now, and globally, we're looking at we have to stop 2 to 3 degrees of temperature increase, right? And this is in 1978. So he sends this warning letter out, and there was no response. And he follows it up a year later that present thinking holds that man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical. So this is well before, this is quite a long time ago, that somebody had already rung the bell within ExxonMobil and said, this is an issue. What we do as a corporation is killing the planet, and nothing was done with it. You gave them the message, things need to happen now, and they didn't do anything. And I think that's where we are right now with DEI. There is a group of folks ringing the bell saying we have an issue. The industry, the outdoors, the community, gateway communities, legislation, all these things that we have out there right now, they're not enough. They still serve predominantly those who hold power and privilege. But the problem is the ones ringing the bell are way, way, way in the back of the room of privilege, and the folks who can make decisions and change it are like so far in the front they can't even hear the bell being rung. So I'm not positive that right now we are where we think we are. We are kind of doing what I introed this with, in that we're just doing a lot of thinking. We're thinking about our own fallibility. We're thinking about the ways that we are complicit in it, the way that we benefit from it, and that's all we're doing is we're talking about it. And people are processing it, they're feeling bad about it, they come back and tell you they feel bad about it, and they understand it, and they hurt and all this stuff. But really nothing's being done. We're not doing anything differently. And I think that we're stuck, you hear about like analysis paralysis and slow change. And I think that is like, those phrases need to go away. I think we need to do things now. And it's easy to say it because I'm of a generation that is starting to like almost phase out of some of it, to be entirely honest, right? Like I've benefited for so long from this that it's almost impossible for me to say like, oh, I can come up with solutions to change this. I don't think I can, to be honest. I can help implement solutions, but especially like if I'm going to be very transparent, as the model minority is a myth, right? But it's not a myth that it has been effective. I mean, I have an Irish first name and a German last name. I don't have an accent when I talk. I grew up in a white family, especially in the outdoor industry. I can use that to my advantage, right? I can walk in a room and they're like, hell yeah, we got one. Like, we're good now, right? Like, it works. It's a thing. So it's almost impossible for me to come up with solutions. So I would love to be able to like have an open conversation about what some solutions might be, because we could have ways. I mean, I'm not sure like what the outcome of all like the coursework you're doing is, but there could be ways to like take these solutions and bring them in to the industry, to the club, to different brands, to like what we're doing with Crux Academy and so on. Yeah, like let's be critical. Like, where did this fall flat? All this work, because it's pretty flat. Like, I'm going to be the first to say it. And like, what could have been done better? So just like all your thoughts.
Yeah. So I'm curious your idea or your thought around this idea that instead of it being something that's internal, that it's explicitly tied to an economic outcome. I worked for a multicultural and generational LGBTQ plus market research and consumer insights firm, and we viewed a lot of DEI consulting as being relatively performative because it didn't drive the needle and there wasn't buy-in across the organization. But if you actually tie it to an economic outcome, the U.S. is going to become majority by 2050 at the latest, and so by building cultural intelligence as a capacity in the organization, that was a more effective way, in our opinion. But I'm just curious, if you think tying it to actual economic outcomes would be something that would be more effective overall.
That's tough because I think categorically yes, right? That's just like how the needle of capitalism moves, right? Is you have to tie everything to some sort of economic driver. You're not going to get support to have human power put towards it, to do anything that will put those projects or those ideas into place. But I feel like that in the end doesn't work. Because right now you can tell a decision maker, minority, majority by 2050. And right now they're worried about getting to 2027, 2028, right? Especially through the recession. So 2050 is their time. They're not going to be the company anymore. They really don't care what the bottom line looks like then. So they're not going to do anything about it. And it's probably not that cut and dry, but that's been my experience at least. These are good ideas, inclusive designs and inclusive sizing and inclusive colorways. Really good ideas, but there's no data that tells them that that's going to make them money. In fact, the data tells them they're going to lose money because they have to do smaller size runs and they have to like expand their colorways and they're going to lose product and all this stuff. And we've done shopper studies in stores, like why did you not buy something today? Because you didn't have the sizes that I need, you don't have the colors I like, and we're finding that gender identity colors don't really matter as much as they used to and all this stuff, but still what we're hearing is, oh, well, that's like a couple hundred shoppers out of hundreds of thousands. This isn't going to make any money. So I'm glad you asked that, because that's something I've been thinking about with my colleagues. Like, how do we do this then? Like, what's the alternative?
So we did position it as a today story and not just a story that you need to worry about 20, 30 years down the line.
Yeah.
These are the consumers that are driving purchasing, they're driving culture forward, etc. And you get some people that get that and we're bought in on that idea. But I mean, take for example Disney with the Black Panther franchise, the first $1 billion plus multicultural focused entertainment franchise in the world, and that's like powered by this dedication to multicultural and diverse storytelling.
Yeah, totally. So that's interesting. Like, is that then that, like, if you look at Hollywood, so like the entertainment industry and then the outdoor industry, right? Like, it's like they're vastly different in size, and they're also vastly different, I think, in consumers. Can you bridge those two? Is there a way to like use the power of the purse of the entertainment industry and apply like that mentality or like that framework to the outdoor industry, which is, it's big, right? But it's still like, what, 1 point something % of our GDP, pretty small. And like the outdoor industry, as we like to think about, at least in this room, like action sports, things like that is very dwarfed by hunting and shooting, right? And OHV and all these things. So it's like, I love that. I think that's exactly like the optic to look at it through. But like, how do you right size that for the outdoor industry? I think I'm asking if anybody has any ideas.
I feel like a really stupid idea. I'm not sure. But like, I've noticed throughout this semester that one of the, I guess, issues with like underrepresented populations and stuff, a lot of times they just don't have access to like outdoor areas that are near them. Has there been any thought or like any programs around something like, I don't know, climbing, but in urban areas or climbing, like something like parkour, but like maybe just more climbing related that you could do in a city or an environment where you don't necessarily have to go all the way up like the middle of an outdoor park or something?
Totally, and I hope you're coming to the next one because we're going to talk about gateway communities and show some cool things that are happening in Utah. But what you're talking about, there's an area in Baltimore called Pigtown, and Bree Horn started Pigtown Climbs, and it's not fully open yet, but it's this outdoor urban space in this like pretty like kind of forgotten about, I could say, part of town. And it's going to be like this meeting and cultural space and a lot of climbing walls. And like, it's going to be friggin' awesome. And before like she had blueprints, she had funding for it. And a lot of it came from within the community. So I only know one example, so I can say it is happening, but I don't know where else. But I think that's a great idea because that is an issue, right? Like access. That's like why I think that the outdoors are so privileged. Getting to a place where you can go recreate, getting to the Flatirons Trail, right? If you're in Aurora, is probably a pretty big ask for a lot of folks. And then what the hell do you do once you get there? Like, right? Do you have the right clothing? I mean, what do you need in terms of like survival of like water and food and all these things? Yeah.
There's like something I just moved from Raleigh, North Carolina, and climbing up there is like a different beast than climbing here. But there's just like Boulder, as an example, is not a diverse place, and but it's also like a mecca of outdoor sports. Do you think that like how do you think that can kind of be approached when this like temple of outdoor recreation, so to speak, is like so homogenous?
Yeah, again, I hope you're coming to the next one. We're going to talk about that. But we're going to talk about it in like rural communities, like really, really small towns. A small town called Orangeville. Yes, you know Orangeville, is vastly different than Boulder. Let me just say that, like very different. So that is actually a really good question because we see that happening where I live right now in Salt Lake. Where a lot of folks are moving into Salt Lake specifically for climbing. A lot of climbing organizations are there. USA Climbing's based out of there, and different brands, Petzl and Black Diamond, and CWA is most likely going to move there. There's all this like insurgence of climbing there. And so it went from a very homogenous white LDS community to like a mostly homogenous white LDS community, and then like this diversity of climbers. And what happened in that short time is affinity groups stood up very fast, just started addressing issues. And I actually use issues like maybe I shouldn't even call them issues, but just gaps and flat spots in the community. Like where are the other climbers of color and the other queer climbers and all these things. And so we've seen that be like a really good example of what it can look like in an urban environment. And then the affinity groups and the LCOs are working together, and they're starting to branch off and work with the gyms and all these things. So it's been a great way for folks to start meeting people of different backgrounds too, through a silly sport of climbing, which is like the most amazing sport in the world. But yeah, and Sam.
Question, just kind of, especially from your perspective, being a board member of the American Alpine Club, and the work you've done with other affinity groups, like in terms of how we created this solution, there isn't one answer here, but it seems like we're also siloing ourselves because of, American Alpine Club don't stretch outside your marketing bounds. And like an REI don't stretch outside their like access fund is for rock climbing. We are for Alpine, like this is our demographic that we need to be focusing on. And how much room now is there, wiggle room is there to start cross-agency work, like the Alpine Club getting involved with the EPA to help like reduce fence line community emissions, to be able to promote public health and increase public access to trailheads, and growing a trailhead there right through, there used to be an industry site, so they have access to a climbing zone on the other side. Like how much can we actually start as these siloed companies, nonprofits, organizations, foundations to step outside of your boundaries and start working in collaboration with other agencies that don't necessarily align with your outdoor mission?
That's a big question. And I was thinking about that earlier because I saw the POW sticker over here. So Graham Zimmerman is our board president, and he's a staff member of POW. And even with that relationship, the AAC and POW don't have like a public relationship. We like pass stuff back and forth and stuff like that. We don't want to step in each other's pools, as we say. And so I think to answer that, and I'd love someone to challenge this, like what I think to be true is probably not true. I think it's kind of like market value, right? Like we as users have to start demanding that. And I was actually telling Seth and Natalie this over lunch. I was out in Lander in Wyoming, like one of my favorite places on the planet, just in general, like to be, to climb, to exist. And my buddy and I went up to this crag called Fossil Hill. And the parking lot is shared with a lot of user groups, but at this particular time, it's also shared with hunters. And so drove up there, and there are like 24 trucks, and I parked my big truck in there. I'm like, oh yeah, this is great. And I realized they're all hunting, and we're the only climbers here. And as we're wandering up to the crag, we realized, we're like, we can see them off in the distance, and we can hear the rifle fire, thinking, hell yeah, hopefully like they got something. And it was just, we're just standing there looking over, like we're using the same space to do things we love, and we care about this area. We should all get to know one another. We should be the ones who go shake hands and talk about what are you doing to conserve this land? Because when I think about that, I think about the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and the Boone and Crockett Club. They do a hell of a lot more than the Alpine Club does for land conservation. By far. They surpass us in membership, in GL, in revenue every way, because they took a stance and said we'll protect lands. And a lot of the orgs, Access Fund, Alpine Club, they protect some lands, only for climbing use, but not for folks just to enjoy. And I don't think we can. I don't think we're big enough. So I think the answer is that we, again, have to start telling the me's, the board members and the executives and things this is important. I'm going to pull my membership if you don't start joining forces with other organizations and working across the aisle or just across the frickin' road, right? Access Fund is here in Boulder, Alpine Club's in Golden, and the two of us don't talk to one another. We used to be under the same roof. We separated, and two hurt kids, we don't talk to each other. It's pretty pathetic, to be honest. But better ideas than that, because that seems again, that's a pretty vanilla idea. That's Milk toast was a phrase I was just introduced to. So, but like, yeah, what do you all think? Like, what's a good solution to get like all these different conservation groups?
Like in the work I'm doing with Taylor, who's Taylor is policy director for the Alpine Club. Like we're focusing on Dolores, which incorporates ATV users, that incorporates Fish and Wildlife Service, that incorporates working with the commissioners who are both red state and blue state. That incorporates all of that and figuring out, the Alpine Club is actually going to be trying to spearhead protecting the climbing area here, but needs to protect the entire area with the collaboration of every single agency. Could this also be a way for us to hold up mirrors to other organizations of like, this is what collaboration looks like if we decide to publicize that?
Yeah.
And like something like that is a powerful statement of bringing equity to the outdoors. Just like as a small example that you can relate to as an Alpine Club, but
Yeah.
things like that for organizations to actually showcase, no, we are actually working together.
Totally. And I think it could also be like folks who do this work and you have like one sport you're really passionate about or one activity, jumping into a different ecosystem, like challenging your own comfort and saying like, I am passionate about protecting access and lands for climbing, but I'm going to go work. And I'm thinking of a very specific person. Her name is Amelia House. She was one of our policy managers at the Alpine Club, and she now works for Trout Unlimited. She'd never really fished, never been an angler, but she knew the work that they did for public lands was really, really good and was more impactful than what she was doing at the club. And that was that was a big conflict for her. She didn't want to leave the Alpine Club. She wanted to protect lands, but it just wasn't happening. And we weren't giving her the tools and resources she needed. We had failed to support her, so she left, and she's doing great work. But I'll also mention when we talk about equity and inclusion, she moved to Lander, so she is the policy advisor for TU for all of Wyoming. And she goes down to Cheyenne to the legislative session, and she calls me after. She's like, you'll never guess what happened. The whole day I'm with this group, and there was one of the guys, and I forget who she said he was with, but he never even looked her in the eye. If he talked to her, he would just refer to her, and then if she talked, he would just look the other way, because she was a woman in a man's world in Wyoming. And we had this conversation because she kept saying that he would just call her cowboy. Just cowboy, cowboy, cowboy. And you get to the point where like it's so crap you have to laugh. I was like, well, Wyoming's that inclusive. Like cowboy just includes everyone. Like that was his vision, right? Like this is a man's world. If you're going to be here, you're a cowboy. You're not even a woman. So it's like these things start intersecting in wild ways.
So I immediately kind of start to think about gamification systems like TikTok, Instagram, software programs like that, where there's a lot of user base to draw from. And I think the most prominent one is Strava. And so I guess I'm just wondering, I just had this idea, a partnership with Strava where there's maybe a community day or community week of some kind where there's a challenge or there's a partnership with REI or some program where people are encouraged to bring others from their community to then participate in a hike, a ride, a climbing events, and then maybe there's some like pool at the end of that where you get entered in to win a new pair of skis or like whatever it is. I don't know, just like utilizing the gamification metrics that everyone knows, which is just social media, because I think that crosses every single boundary because everyone is on social media.
Yeah.
And kind of like leveraging that to be more inclusive, because I love Strava and I think it can be restrictive sometimes, kind of like with the name calling, the FKTs and like the competitive nature of it, and then maybe making it a little bit more inclusive so that people like myself who are a part of that like competitive landscape can allow others to join in and actually like learn about the space was an idea I had.
It's friggin' awesome. Yeah. Holy crap. Yeah. I never think about like using technology like as a way to like to bring folks together. Yeah, we should talk about that.
Sure.
My friend Caitlin Landsberg was the creative director for Strava for a while. Then she started a beer company, and then she sold the beer company. Now she just travels around the world. It's great. but that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a pretty like easily accessible way to like bring folks in to the fold.
They do that stuff already through like challenge initiatives where like, oh, a monthly goal of however many steps or miles, or like, let's raise money for this fundraising, I don't know, charity or whatever. But I've never seen them actually do a community-oriented
Yeah.
session of inclusivity, which I think is very surprising.
Yeah, it is, and maybe like in some ways it's not, because like Stravasshole, right? Like I fell into that deep. It's very like, yeah, you get invited into a community group, you're like, oh yeah, like people have noticed.
Change their narrative a little bit. I feel
Totally.
because they have the biggest user base of any outdoor application I'm aware of,
Yeah.
and they're a unicorn company as well. So, yeah.
Wow. Yes, that's awesome. Great. Cool. What other ideas are there? This is great.
I don't want to be like super cynical coming off that like great creative idea, but I feel like
Then don't say it. No, I'm kidding.
the lack of inclusion in outdoor spaces and diversity in outdoor spaces is really just a symptom of a society that has a lot of problems in the realm of inclusion and diversity, and has a history of a government that marginalizes certain racial and ethnic communities. And I think like the most effective way for a company to work towards solving diversity in the space that they specialize in is to make a significant contribution towards like those greater political goals, because for historically marginalized communities, I don't think lack of access to climbing is like the issue that they face.
Yeah.
It's the issue that climbing faces, and so like the climbing community can approach that by maybe making more strides to helping those marginalized communities in their political systems and cities and governing and stuff like that.
Dude, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, 'cause like we just had 2.5 days of strategic planning at the American Alpine Club board, and it was like, at the end of the day, that was kind of the conversation. It's like, we're going to talk about DEI, but how many folks of underserved communities, socioeconomically like downtrodden communities, like they're not thinking about climbing.
Yeah.
They might have like seen it, maybe a friend took them, they're like, cool, that was fun. I got bigger problems to worry about than like accessing a climbing gym or some rock faces.
I will say Connor did a presentation in our class a couple weeks ago about a climbing gym in, where was that again?
Memphis Rocks.
I was about to talk about it.
Yeah.
Dude, yes.
And it seemed like they were like really crossing that boundary of like,
Yeah.
it's helping get inclusion in climbing, but it's also helping the more broad issues that are affecting society.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to bring up like one opportunity that I see like continually miss is like it's like climbing specific because it's from Memphis Rocks, but it's mountaintop media, and the idea of giving a community that traditionally doesn't engage in certain activities the ability to not only tell their story but represent and build their story from the ground up. And like there's a film called Black Ice, which was made by Mountaintop Media, and that's the first time I've ever heard a broader climbing community ever talk about diversity. It was after that film came out. So I think supporting initiatives for like that creative vision of those communities is really valuable.
I love that you brought that up, because have folks seen Black Ice, the film, by chance? So it was this very, very revered mountaineer, Conrad Anker, took a group of all black climbers from Memphis. Was it Montana? Did they go? Yeah, they went and they did a bunch of ice climbing. It was like, it looked honestly terrible. They're like camping in the snow. They're like shitting this, like everything in the snow. And these kids are like, what in the hell? And so, of course, like it's a really good feel-good movie. But like you said, Connor, like it got the community talking. And a lot of the conversation people started having was like, oh, look at this white saviorism. Like he takes him out to go climbing one time, right? Which was not the case. Like it created a whole movement. But what I did like about it was having those cynical conversations. But I think more so than cynical, very real conversations. Like, yeah, that is an issue. Like, it's not enough just to like take people out one time to like, here's this cool thing. Like, it's so far from where you live and your experience. Like, you're never gonna do it again. Like, we're gonna make a film about it, feel good about ourselves. It's gonna be great. Thankfully, that wasn't what was happening, but I think the conversation was good that it was happening.
I think along that same vein, I think Memphis Rocks obviously was like the first one that started it, but I think there's room for gyms all across the country to really implement at least a sliding pay scale, which we've seen at like a couple progressive gyms, but even like the Front in Salt Lake doesn't even offer something like that, and they're known as like a premier gym in the country. Everybody looks to them as like such an innovative leader, and they're doing nothing on that front, and they make a lot of money. Like, and Movement, a huge conglomeration of gyms, they're making $100 per person, and they have so many members that they could absolutely be implementing that for like people that need it. And I also think there's a lot of room that they could be doing a lot of like school outreach, because we all know that if you like start kids young, they're gonna like grow a passion for it, they'll grow up to be younger or like more enthusiastic about it. So I think that's a really big area that elementary schools have kids from every single background, and if these gyms and like ski resorts, because I know they do like, oh, fifth graders ski free or something, but I think if they really like pushed into that a little bit more, it would have a lot longer and bigger of an impact.
100%. 100%.
I also think it's hard too because I think there's a lot of appreciation for sports and all that you can get out of that sport, but it doesn't always accompany like appreciation for the earth that you're doing the sport on. And so you can say that you're really into the environment because you love rock climbing, but then you're not doing like what we've been talking about. You're not doing anything back to the environment. So starting kids young with rock climbing, that's great, but it's not enough just to start them with the sport. You need to start them with the environmental education that goes with the sport, and I think that's missing in a lot of places.
I agree. And I think to both of those points, it's just not going to be done by the big box gyms because they have a model that makes them a ton of money. The owner of the front and the owner of Momentum, those folks are wealthy beyond belief from a model that works for them. And like that's why I say like it's like Memphis Rocks that came from funding money that came out of Hollywood, right? Like saw a need in his community, built this thing. It's community based, right? And folks can go there and access education and power and resources and all and shelter and all these things that they need. And I think and that's why like I was so excited to do this and to meet all of you because this is where those ideas are going to come from, which I know sounds like a cop out and probably kind of is if I like look inward because it's like I'm not going to be the one doing it. But like someone has to, and it's not going to be like assholes like me who are going to do it, right? Like it's going to be like all of you because it's like it has to start from the ground. It has to be community based. It has to be a community center, a community gym, a community ski school, whatever that is, based in Boulder, based in Salt Lake, based in Chattanooga, wherever it is, right? That serves a greater good. Yeah.
So I'm not in soy. I'm in a different study here. So I don't have quite the same foundation that you guys have developed. And forgive me for that. But I do wonder about how the outdoor industry, or let's not call it that, like playing outside started very differently than how it has progressed. And personally, I am so drawn to it for its down-to-earth, open, energy. And going back to Dale's point about like how our society operates around us, I feel like climbing was originally, just as one example of what we talk about, it was like kind of originally born with people who weren't part of the mainstream and who actually did have a lot of these values. And I'm kind of curious, like, did all this commodification of it arise out of a desire to progress the abilities of people who are in the sport so that they could have, better gear and accomplish more? Was it, these people kind of like rising to the level of the society around them and like trying to keep up with and prove that they can also be part of that? And it's just really interesting to think about, like, something that was originally so organically right going the wrong way. And is it actually possible to like implement at higher levels and go back, or does it have to start from the ground up, which is how it originated? I don't know. It kind of breaks my heart to be in this room and realize what you guys are all working on because I don't know. It's not how I see the outdoors, but clearly it is here and matters. But I think a lot of people who are in the outdoors also have the right intention and good hearts, and I wonder if it's possible to just grassroots style as opposed to from top down.
That's a really, really big question. Because you're right, we have taken our natural resources and turned them into a commodity. And a very valuable, viable economy is based on the destruction of land. I was out with some climbing friends and there were some OHVs going by. I was like, oh, we should do that on like one of our rest days. They're like, oh, they're so destructive, they're terrible for the land, blah, blah, they're so polluted. I'm like, we all drove down here. We put bolts in rocks. We cut trails. We throw crash pads down. Like this rock is deteriorating. We're destroying all of it. We're covering this stuff in chalk. It's ugly now. Like everything we do as outdoor recreationists is damaging the land. And so I think that is an incredible inward question for the outdoor community. It's like, do we care about the land the way we say we do? Because personally, I don't think a lot of us do. We wish we did, but if you talk to indigenous folks, we certainly do not. We're not caretakers of the land. We're users of the land. Conservation is like maintaining it to make money, not for spiritual or cultural reasons.
You know, so I see a lot of times when certain communities are included in a certain activity, the first step is they'll basically pay for the space. So they'll create a club or something. And a lot of times usually that's defined by like what they're being excluded by. So it's like they'll say like, there's an example, like the Black Climbers Club is doing that. My question is, do you have any ideas or anything how do we take that next step? So that's not even an issue. It's like it doesn't have to be the Black Climbers Club. It can just be a climbers club. Yeah.
I think that it was Dale, right?
Yeah.
I think that is answered well by Dale's comment about these are just like ecosystems within a broader society. And again, I was talking to Seth and Natalie about this. You know, I'm not super old. I just probably shouldn't talk about being old so much. I'm 38, but I'm around a lot of younger climbers often. And the way that they care for one another and talk to one another, and when I say younger, I mean like early 20s, it's super special. They navigate the world a lot differently than I grew up navigating the world, and I think especially folks older than me. And so in some ways, I think to answer your question, it's just natural that that's going to start happening. As we have these conversations, as people are made aware of how othered somebody sitting right next to them might feel in ways that they don't know about, and as our hearts expand and our minds start to follow that, I think that naturally will happen. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, like in our lifetimes soon, but we're going to start seeing it. But I think we have to keep challenging that though, because right now, if you go and ask BGC, like, why do you exist? They say, we need to. Why do you need to? Because folks have othered us. Well, why do they other you? Is it in your mind or is it happening? You go down this like cacophony of you know, back and forth. But we have to challenge that, because when we challenge it, we have to realize like, no, we shouldn't need these groups. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, why is it that when we leave here, we start to divide ourselves? Like, I'll go to like my Asian climbing club and you'll go to your white climbing club and all these things, right? Because right now we still need to. But I think we have to continually ask that question until like the answers start to reveal itself, which again is probably a cop-out. Like, I don't have an answer for that. I got a lot of cop-outs, so what else can I not answer? I can even do this all night. Yeah.
Is the intention for the Crux Academy to like develop that further and like take it deeper, or because it sounds like with some of the other like trainings out there that are performative, like there's a need for it to kind of be taken a step further?
Yeah, thank you for asking. That was the only reason that I was willing to sign on, was that their intention was to go really far with it, and that we want to do conversations. So instead of learnings, we'll have folks talking about their experiences outdoors in like a very conversational manner that will show like, this is what we talk about when we say people have been othered. Like, we really want to like, almost like podcast style, like get down there. But also like, I love transparency. When you work with brands like REI, shit goes south real fast. The second something goes wrong and misses a timeline, they start threatening to pull contracts. And that's exactly what started happening. So again, big corporation, big money, multi-billion-dollar organizations are never going to really believe what they're doing is right unless it's making a lot of money for them. And their legal departments and their procurement departments started seeing this is probably not going to make a bunch of money. And so they started just dumping it on us. And as I'm driving from Salt Lake to Boulder this morning, I'm on phone calls talking about this stuff to their legal team, to our teams. So the plan is we're going to go forward with it. We just don't know who it's going to be with. But you know, there were questions about like big corporations making change. Like, I'm on your side with like cynicism. I think pessimism and realism are kind of the same thing sometimes. I don't think they're going to do the change. It's not going to be big corporations. We're looking at like smaller funding for this, because it means people really believe it. If they have less to give and are going to give a lot of it, then they really believe it. Because REI's got tons to give. They're not paying us a whole boatload for this, but they want to start pulling away money just to like prove their strength in this. Sorry, went off on a tangent, but yes, there's going to be more to it.
Right on the Crocs Academy, it wasn't quite clear to me. Who accesses that media?
Yeah, great question. So all the equity and inclusion modules are free for everybody, but the rest of Crux Academy, most of the content in there is paywalled. And I'm, again, full transparency, their whole pitch is a little problematic. It's learning management for the core outdoor user. So right now it's like, how do you highball with Nina Williams and backcountry ski with Brody and like all this like extreme stuff. And that was another part of the DEI modules. Like we gotta start putting that back. Like we gotta just talk about like, if you wanna go hiking, like what does that take? You wanna go camping? And so we're actually releasing that content. And the cool thing was, we started shopping that around to brands and we got immediate buy-in of like, again, it's gonna be revenue based. Like they talk about hiking, you're in their hiking shoes, but it's a start, right? We're just like showing like entry level, I shouldn't even say entry level, just accessible stuff. Oh, yeah.
So I was in the Newberg Gorge when all of the renaming of routes was like happening and going down. So that's a super like deep climbing community.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of climbers didn't want to lose the clout that they got from saying they sent certain names, even though they were really problematic. And so in my opinion, I'm thinking like the longer that the renames get used and it's more common, like that will just kind of fade. And I'm curious if you think that will also happen, or if people are going to really hang on to like, no, I sent this really hard 513D, but I'm not saying the name. Or if like eventually just with time, like other people will recognize like that's what it means. And then I'm curious what the direction of Climb United is going now. And since you stepped away from the project, like that was kind of their whole big thing was starting that. So just kind of where that's going and how like impactful you think that's going to be. Just because I feel like that is kind of like the one big thing in climbing that everybody looks to, like, oh, they're doing such a good job.
Wow, great questions. First one, I think that's going to happen. I think if people start using different names, it'll be embarrassing to use the old name. And actually, Fred Knapp, who in Sharp End Publishing, just down the road here in Boulder, he was opposed to this work. We had like 6 hours of conversations one week, and we ended up like coming out with like a really strong friendship. His opinion was, I'll put the name, if they don't want to change it, I'll put the name, but their name is right next to it. So people will know if they're racist, sexist, misogynist, whatever. I'm like, that actually works. It's like calling out, right? So this is good. This is the people will use it. They'll be the ones that are embarrassed. To answer your other question, Climb United right now is building a library of affinity groups. So you can go there and like look for a resource. Like I've moved to this town. I want to know affinity groups near me, which is fine. You could find that elsewhere, but it's good. And they're also looking at building more inclusive events around the country. I think it's good, but I don't think it's great. And I don't think that it is worthy of the praise that we get as the American Alpine Club. Yeah, we could talk more about that. I'll talk all about that. Yeah, it's not moving the dial on anything, to be honest.
I'm not really familiar with who's on the board, but what's the diversity look like even on the board in terms of?
That's a good question. Somewhat. We've done a good job of getting younger folks on the board. I would say that there are, right now, it's about 50-50, men and women, but all cisgendered. We have some color on the board. There's myself and 2 other folks. But our board president is a cis-hetero white man, and that move was put in place long before anybody had a voting option on it. And the folks on, it's, again, not great. Maybe not even good. It's getting somewhere. Yeah. Wow, I'm pessimistic, aren't I? Shoot, this is supposed to be positive. Sorry about that.